So I thought last time when I made this video was going to be the only time that I made a video talking about solo queue Mythic Plus. So there's been a bit of a more discussion about what an experiment of solo queue Mythic Plus would look like. Would that be good and healthy for the game? I kind of want to explain again the reasons why it would not be super good for the game in general. I do understand how there is like a utopian society thing where people want to, AFK and have like a solo player experience, or they believe that getting into groups via Group Finder is too arduous, or there's just like a large problem with like sitting around and getting into groups via Group Finder, sitting for hours. That's unfun. I understand that, right? Like, but I don't think that solo queue is the correct solution. And I think that people who, whenever they sit in Group Finder for hours, and they're like, oh, this is not very fun, or they end up sitting there like waiting for groups and they're getting lots of declines. I feel like that's a pretty typical experience of just using Group Finder in general. Whenever you're doing that, that's not very fun. And then you play other games and you get match made into a group like almost instantly. Say you play like League of Legends, or say you play any other game with like a matchmaking system. You even use like the LFD tool or whatever. You get match made into a game. That feels like a better experience in some aspects, where you don't have to interact with the 5 players to form the group and whatever else. But let's talk about a lot of the reasons why it would not be very good. So a large portion of this, for at least the reason I'm making this video, is spurred by a tweet that Mr. GM tweeted about 9 hours ago, where he said, I would love to see what could be done with the experiment of Mythic Plus solo queue. And I think that there are a lot of problems that are not very... Okay, there are a lot of surface level things that would be nice. Like, it would fix the sitting in Group Finder for hours problem, but there are a lot of problems that it would create that are not just something that you like see as like surface level issues. First and foremost, and this is something that I talked about in the last video that I made talking about Mythic Plus solo queue, an MMR system, like you need like an automated matchmaking system. It only works for PvP due to like how MMR works, where the MMR goes up and down, and it also only works for trivial content. So with an MMR system, first off, your score has to go up and down whether or not you time or deplete keys. And I don't feel like that's something that works super well with how Mythic Plus is structured. Because generally, especially if you're like actually pushing keys that are difficult to score for you, you only have somewhere in the order of like maybe even like a 50% success rate, maybe even lower. And there's like a lot of issues with like how an MMR system would even work with Mythic Plus in general. Are you supposed to actually lose points if people leave your key? Like, are you supposed to lose points the moment somebody like depletes your key? How is a penalty applied? I think that's all like a major issue. But in general, I don't think an MMR system really works for Mythic Plus. And a solo queue experience, like a solo queue is like a matchmaking system that places players in a group together to allow you to gain or lose MMR typically. And doing something like that in World of Warcraft makes sense whenever you have an MMR system like in PvP, but it doesn't make sense whenever you have something like we have with Mythic Plus score. It's not exactly the same thing. Another major issue is like the reward structure. I think that as it currently stands, LFG has a lot of problems, but one of the things that LFG actually does pretty well is LFG allows you to queue for very specific groups, depending on what your desires are. Say you want to be pushing those keys, you're able to queue for keys that are a non-trivial level for you that sometimes have things listed as like push group, right? Say you want to queue into a group that is going for completion. There are groups that are listed in Group Finder that are going for completion. Say you want to queue up for 12s for Crest Farm. There are Crest Farm groups. I think that's something that LFG does pretty well, is it allows you to kind of have your goals aligned with the other players inside of your group, and it allows you to be selective with who you're playing with and what the goals of the group are. And so like the reward structure of a solo queue, typically the reward is just MMR gained or lost, right? It's not actually end of dungeon rewards. And like I think in a solo queue system, people I don't think they've really thought about it too thoroughly, but you wouldn't be getting rewarded with loot from solo queue normally. Now, that's not something that would be impossible to implement, but I think in general, like if there was going to be a solo queue for WoW Mythic Plus, it shouldn't include getting loot at the end of the dungeon. The solo queue experience should be like a ranked partition of WoW, and it should be like what the scoring system turned into, right? It should be like the scoring system would turn into the solo queue, not the gearing process. The gearing process would almost certainly be separate, which would then still leave you with LFG without people who are pushing score inside of it, which again feels a bit weird. There are other ways. I don't want this to come across as like I'm arguing a point that's not valid. There are other ways that you could reward doing solo queue Mythic Plus, but I think that there is like whenever you think about creating a solo queue, there is a large problem with the reward structure of what a solo queue would look like for World of Warcraft Mythic Plus. In addition to that, there are other, and I would describe them as minor issues, but in reality, these are things that are like pretty big friction depending on like what kind of player you are. First off, class balance and comp requirements as it currently stands, LFG right now. More often than not, you don't need comp requirements. Depends on the key level that you're doing. But the ability to be able to get the composition you're looking for, including things like battle res or bloodlust or whatever else, is actually kind of nice. Now it sucks for classes that aren't meta. I think that that's something that's pretty problematic, and I think that this is a universal experience of if you're not playing like a meta specialization, you're going to be sitting in LFG for like hours on end sometimes, waiting to get an invite from somebody who's like, oh yeah, I don't think the spec is like really too bad. Or it kind of fits what we're looking for. But in reality, if you're on the other end of that, say you say you're one of the people that can be selective, you're looking for a composition that fits like what your group's needs are. And while that does suck sometimes for the people who are applying to groups, for the people who are selecting the groups, more often than not, that becomes beneficial. And that's why I typically advocate for people to create their own groups in Group Finder. Like whenever we talk about it on the podcast pretty regularly, it's like creating your own group in Group Finder, if you were dead set on not playing with a pre-made, creating your own group is by far the easiest way to get into a group and actually be able to do volume of keys. Because you're the person who's creating the group, right? And then that allows you to be picky if you're playing with a complete pre-made. But like at the end of the day, class balance and comp requirements, that's going to start to become a problem at some point. And say you end up in a group. I've just recently tested Throne of the Tides. Throne of the Tides has a ton of kicks that are required and a ton of stops that are required. And say you get into a group with like a low amount of kicks or a low amount of stops. Is there going to be like a duplicate specialization clause? Is there going to be like a clause where you have to have this many interrupts, where you have to have this many AoE stops? What are you supposed to do whenever some specializations are seen as nearly necessary for particular dungeons? And if you think about things such as Brackenhide Hollow or Halls of Infusion this season, where Shadow Priest was nearly required, especially once you start to get to the higher end, but like even at the like a medium end, whatever Shadow Priest is seen as almost mandatory, like what are you supposed to do with class balance and comp requirements? Like how is that really going to work out? That really is going to create like a pretty large problem if you were just getting queued into it. Because if I'm a balanced druid and I get queued into a group and there's another balanced druid in that group, I'm going to be annoyed, right? Like I'm going to be annoyed. They're going to be annoyed. It's going to be a bad time. Like the rest of the group's going to be annoyed because we know we were playing at like probably a 2 or 3 key level delta relative to where we could be if we were playing with a better group composition that more readily fit our strengths, I think is what I would say. In addition to that, levers, how are those supposed to be punished? I don't think that I've ever seen a solution that I'm like, oh my god, that's great. Because as it currently stands, levers aren't great, especially in your Mythic Plus dungeon. But what I will say is one of the advantages of is whenever somebody leaves a key, you immediately just go and you jump back in Group Finder and you start to look for another group, right? Or you list your key again and you look for another group. That's totally fine. How are you supposed to punish levers? Are they supposed to get like 100% of the MMR loss with that? Are they supposed to get 100% of the rating loss if they leave the key? Are you supposed to be punished if they leave the dungeon in general? Like there's no really great solution with what happens to people who leave runs in progress, and I think that would end up creating an experience where players, it is a more negative experience than the positives of somebody leaving your key 15 minutes and then you have to go and find a new group, which I will admit is a really shitty experience. It's something that I deal with pretty regularly too whenever I'm plugging keys. Like I think that people like to think that I only do the highest level of keys or whatever, but like if you ever watch my stream, especially at the beginning of the season, I do probably like 60 keys a week, maybe, for the first like 2 or 3 weeks of the season. And these are the first 3 weeks of the season, and it is almost exclusively in pugs. Very infrequently do I do a key the first couple of weeks of the season that is outside of a pug. And if you think I'm doing like 120 keys or so, 150 keys maybe in LFG, like I clearly have like I end up having like an LFG experience fairly often whenever I'm actually doing these dungeons. And like levers are shitty. Like I like being very frank, and sitting in group finder for hours, especially if your specialization isn't meta, is not fun. Like being very, very honest, it is not a fun experience. But queuing and creating a queuable experience is not really the solution. In addition to that, the queue times will get worse. So there was this weird phenomenon with solo shuffle where before you would have to look in LFG to create a group for 2s or 3s if you wanted to PvP. But whenever and so that allowed you to actually like jump in and jump out as you wanted to. But whenever shuffle was added, the amount of games that you were playing actually went down, and you ended up spending a lot more time in queue. And for basically everybody who's not a healer, for a lot of average PvPers right now, it created this thing where you end up sitting in queue for like 30 to 45 minutes waiting to get put into one solo shuffle group just for somebody to leave in the middle of it. And that is really unfun. And I swear, if you had to wait in a queue for 30 minutes for a Mythic Plus dungeon just for somebody to leave, that is going to build animosity against the system even more so than what we have currently. Now, I don't think that what we have right now is current, but I do think it is significantly better than a Mythic Plus solo queue experience. I think that like sitting in group finder for hours up on end is not fun. Again, I reiterate this multiple times. That is not the fun part of what Mythic Plus realistically is. But I think that like LFG, it does an okay enough job at aligning players' goals together. Where you're allowed to have different groups that are going for completion to get gear. They're crest farming. Some people are pushing score, and there's a lot of different group dynamics that are happening. And I think that LFG does a pretty good job of doing that. In addition to that, like, what are you supposed to do whenever you're running? You only need to run like Halls of Infusion for score, and then you keep getting placed into something like Brackenhide Hollow, like 3 keys in a row. How is that really going to make you feel? Whereas right now, you're able to be a bit more selective with what key you're joining, right? Where you're looking, oh, I need Halls of Infusion for this reason. I need it for score. Let me only apply to Halls of Infusion keys. And I think that the current system does a really good job of that. You're not just going to select from a drop-down box to place you into a key that you very specifically need. That's not really how it's going to end up working. Like I guess technically it could, but that's even going to further exacerbate the problem of queue times are going to get worse for players. In addition to that, like, how are you supposed to appropriately place players that are pretty low item level? Like that's also going to be like, that would be a major problem with the system in general. I think that like, how are you supposed to really place players that are 405 item level who haven't touched a Mythic Plus key in their life? Are they supposed to go straight into 2s? Like there's a lot of issues with that. Whereas how are you supposed to appropriately place somebody who's 440 item level on alt who hasn't touched the solo queue system? Are you supposed to place them into 2s with the people who are 405 item level? That's a bit of a weird experience as well. I think there are a lot of pretty glaring issues with just solo queue in general. But I think if you like look at PvP, and I think that if you look at PvP as a conduit for what Mythic Plus will turn into, solo shuffle absolutely killed the 2s and 3s bracket for PvP. Basically, there are very few people who are playing 2s or 3s anymore, and I don't think the current ecosystem we have for Mythic Plus is worth completely annihilating to create a solo queue experiment that Mr. GM is talking about here, right? I think that like the current Mythic Plus ecosystem we have right now is okay. I don't think it's perfect by any means. I think it is acceptable for what is necessary within the game, and I think it can improve. But I don't think that completely reinventing what we have right now would solve that. I think that for Mythic Plus, and things that I'm looking at that would increase the experience or make the experience better is I think that they added the ping system, and that's definitely I don't think it's like perfect, but I think that that's actually not too bad. In addition to that, I think that like I think the scoring system actually incentivizes players to play on a different level. I think that the way that the reward structure for Mythic Plus has actually been moving in a pretty positive direction. I would like to see some changes with affixes in general. Again, I think that like going into 11.0, that's maybe something I'm going to start creating more and more videos about, is kind of hammering into affixes and how to make Mythic Plus a bit more of a fun experience. But I think that like in general, what we would see from a Mythic Plus solo queue thing is something similar to PvP, where it would absolutely just destroy the ecosystem, and then people would only play Shuffle, right? People only play Shuffle now. It completely killed the 2s and 3s bracket in the process, even though it's like a pretty... I think Solo Shuffle is a pretty good system. It completely killed what was previous, and I don't think that that's what we're looking for. Overall, though, I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts down in the comment section. I didn't expect to have to create another video talking about why I thought that Solo Queue Mythic Plus was not it, but here we are. And, you know, I'm sure I'm going to start creating more videos once the next season starts. I've been on a bit of a hiatus, been on a League arc and been on a TFT arc lately. I'll be back next season, I'm sure, making more videos, making more stream content. I've been streaming PTR keys as well, so come check on that whenever you want. And I will see you guys in the next video.